Good morning. I think we all know who our teacher is today. Were you going to tell me something?
Not going to be visible.
Oh, okay. Well, good. Then I'll just stand back here. So we have Dr. Christian Wilson today, who we all know and love. And he's going to be speaking on Mark Stephanus, aka Robert Estienne. Did I say it right this time? All right. I learned that that's a French name. And the lectionary. So thank you for coming, and we're excited to hear.
Let's see, and I'm going to need a Havana, just like to take a few things that I will pass around. As you might imagine, I'm exceedingly low tech and thankful to Nelson for getting the screens up. Okay, first question. What language was the Bible originally written in?
Which part of the Bible?
Let's try it again. I'll make it easier. What language was the New Testament originally written in? It's not a trick question.
Greek.
Greek. Okay. How many of you have ever seen a Greek New Testament? A couple of you. Well, Marianne, you may be Vanna. I'll just pass one around. And this is, so you can see what it looks like.
Oh, question.
All right, good.
Why was the New Testament written in Greek and why was the why was the New Testament written in Greek and not Latin?
Because Greek was the international language, the lingua franca of the Roman Empire. Excuse me. Latin, well, the other thing, all of the earliest Christian writers lived within the Greek-speaking world, and for most of the major part of it, that's where they lived. Where they lived is where Greek was spoken. Latin, we don't have our first Latin biblical text. Doesn't come before about 4th century. And as the church expanded westward, we know we have a church at Rome by the mid-40s. And so people are doubtless beginning, there probably are translations that early, but we don't have manuscripts in Latin that early. But that is a good lead-in to, does that answer your question? Okay. It's a good lead-in in terms of, yeah, the New Testament's written in Greek. What language did Jesus speak? Aramaic. So when we get the words of Jesus, which I will be reading in just a few moments, they have at some point been translated from Aramaic into Greek. The other thing I should note, what I said was a good lead-in, is that Mark may have been a native Latin speaker. We have a few reasons to think this. One, the name Marcus is Latin. It's a Latin name, Roman name. And there are more Latinisms, Latin phrasings Latin, sometimes whole Latin words in the Gospel of Mark, far more than in any other gospel. Where Mark came from, there's Venice claims him. I don't think there was any Venice, but a swamp back in that time. But he very likely had, well, the other thing is his Greek. It's, I always have my Greek students reading Mark and First John. Those are the two easiest things to start off with. It's a very, Mark writes in a very easy Greek. Not, you go from Mark to Luke, and Luke you have very flowing 5-line periodic sentences that Greek writers love to put together. Yeah. So today, this is the year in the lectionary, year B, where most of our text, our scripture readings for worship, or the gospel readings will be from Mark. The way the lectionary goes, we have years A, B, and C. A is the Matthew year, B, the Mark year, C, the Luke year, and John interspersed. Yeah, and when does the year start?
Advent.
Yes, first Sunday in Advent. So we are fairly well into Mark at this point. I'll talk a lot more about Mark in a couple of minutes, but want to explain something that's a good thing. It's a good thing. That's just I would not expect any of you would know who that guy Stephanus is, but he changed the way you read the Bible. He was, Stephanus was his trade name, and I think I'm gonna stand up. Turn this over here. Okay, we're still, okay, I like being on par with you. He was a printer. Printing was a fairly new occupation. The printing press had only been written in, or only been invented in 1470. In the year 1554, this printer, Stephanus Robert Estienne, made a major change in the Bible that changed the way you read it. The ideas on what that might be?
Versification?
Yes. Thank you. Is that Dean back there? Okay. He made the verses. He divided the entire Bible into verses. And now we see those verses are reference numbers for us. And so we can say John 3:16, and you know what we're talking about. You can find that very easily in your Bible. Before Stephanus, it was something like, oh, it's in that for God so loved the world thing it's in the Gospel of John somewhere toward the front. Just keep you didn't really have the verses were an enormous help. And so Bibles since that time in every language, I think, have been separated into verses. And you think about that, it's sort of natural. When Paul wrote his letters, have you ever marked out verses for any letter you wrote? Nah, no. So now there is a negative to versification. The negative is that it makes us even subconsciously see the Bible in small chunks. What we do in worship, the lectionary, we'll do a few verses. Say we're doing gospel text today. It will do a few verses. It might be, but you don't do a whole book. And whole books are the way the Gospels are written. They're written to be read like books, not to be, excuse me, not to be dismantled in the versification way. Excuse me, I'll get over it. Okay. Well, the other thing, showed you, let's see, we got the second, let's get the second screen up. There we go. Tell you that Mark was written about between 65 and 70.
Go back to the microphone.
Mark was written about 65 to 70. It was the earliest manuscript we have of Mark is a papyrus manuscript from Egypt that dates to about 200 AD. So there's considerable gap between the time Mark was written and the time of our earliest manuscript of it. Mark, as we have it written now, it's a pretty good text in terms of there haven't been that many changes to it over those couple of centuries. Two huge changes, however, were made in the 5th century, where some chunks of verses, like 11, are added to the end of Mark and show up in manuscripts later than 5th century, and will consequently show up in things like the King James Bible. And if you've got a new NRSV, it will give you a footnote or let you know that the endings of Mark are not part of the original writing of Mark. Okay.
Oh, Christian,
Yes.
was that those extra verses at the end of Mark, did Jerome include those in his Vulgate when we did have a Latin Bible?
Yes, I think. There were Latin Bibles before Jerome and the Vulgate. We call them Old Latin, and there are a lot of variations among them. And there are probably some, that'd be a good thing for me to check out, Dean. I'll do a little research on that. Okay. So what I want to do now is for us in the next minutes to look at Mark as a whole. And I'm not going to do it in terms of a summary of Mark, but rather look at it in terms of what is Mark's literary strategy? What is Mark doing? Mark is beginning a new literary genre, gospel. There were no gospels before Mark. And what he does in putting together the Gospel of Mark is a bit of literary genius. Now, if you read Mark, start reading Mark cover to cover, you'll find it seems quick, jumpy, staccato. We've seen jump from one to another, frequently with the word immediately being almost a conjunction for Mark. I think it's 41 times Jesus did this, and immediately he said this. And so Mark moves the action pretty quickly. And as I've looked at all this over many years, and read a lot of commentaries, I want to put together for us one way of looking at the Gospel of Mark. Here's the way I and a lot of others see it. Mark hinges on 8:27 through 29. Three different themes will hinge on those verses. And just in the unlikely event that any of you have forgotten what 8:27, 29 through 29 is, I'm going to read. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi, sorry, I don't have a map, is way up in the north of Israel, very near the border of Lebanon. It will be as far north as Jesus with his disciples goes. He will make a side trip once to Tyre in Lebanon. That's a little farther north than this, but he's about as far north as he goes. So he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. We're going to find in the first 8 chapters, we all know who Jesus is, but he's encountering people who don't know who he is. And in Mark, he keeps that identity, his divine identity, concealed. This is a theme that, way up there, 1901, William Rader wrote a book called Das Messias-Geheimnis in Seite Evangelium. Just had to say that. The Messianic Secret in the Second Gospel. And what he Rader notes is that until this point, Peter's saying you are the Messiah. At this point, nobody else knows who Jesus, knows his messianic identity. They know what Jesus does, that he does miracles, he makes sermons, speeches, parables. They know what he does, but they don't really know who he is. And that Breda sees that as being a literary invention of Mark. I might note that Mark, I talked about being choppy and quick jumps from one story to another. Well, Mark, was one German scholar, Carl Ludwig Schmidt, who said that if you wrote all of the stories, write one story, one miracle story on a piece of paper, write a parable on another piece, write on separate pieces of paper, everything before the 15th chapter of Mark, where the crucifixion comes, put them all on different pieces of paper, throw them up in the air, fall down, gather them in. You could rewrite Mark and it wouldn't be a bit of difference. It's just one miracle after another, one saying after another. Scholars, and I guess the one who led the charge on this was Philly Markson in his book, Mark the Evangelist, began to see patterns in Mark, and that Mark he didn't just throw it all down. It's very intentional in what he does, and he makes that there are three, or at least what I delineate as three different themes that in Mark hinge on the verses I just read to you, Peter's, and I think I've got to read the next thing to you. Then as soon as Jesus, as soon as Peter tells Jesus, you are the Messiah, then, verse 31, then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo suffering and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And then Peter rebukes him. Going down to verse 34, Jesus called a crowd and said, if anyone wishes to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. This is the first intimation that Jesus, if you follow Jesus, you may suffer for it. And quite a few 100,000 millions of people have. Okay, so here's what I see is these three themes, and they all come together hinging on chapter 8, which is right in the middle of the book, 16 chapters in the book. First of all, I'm just going to call it a theme of geography. Where Jesus is also helps us understand in a way who he is. Mark does not have a birth story. Jesus comes from Nazareth, which is in the region of Galilee. There are three regions in Israel at the time, or Palestine, I could say. And again, I'm sorry for the lack of maps, but the northern region is Galilee. Marianne and I've been have any of the rest of you been to Jerusalem or Marianne, Ken? Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, it's beautiful. if you go, oh, and the land around it is verdant. And the lake itself, it's a Sea of Galilee is a freshwater lake. It's just lovely. As you start traveling south, which Jesus did on foot, and I have always done it on bus. You look out of the window of the bus, the land, this lush green land, gets more rocky. And the further south you go into Judea, the more desert-like it becomes. Galilee, lovely. Judea, where Jerusalem is rocky. You go a little further south than that and you're in the Negev desert. So in Galilee, beautiful Galilee, Jesus is there the first 8 chapters of Mark, and he does miracles, he does teachings, parables. He has some disputes with some Pharisees. He has a little bit what sounds like a dispute with his family, but basically everything is going beautifully. His ministry is growing. He's gotten 4,000 to 5,000 people hearing him on the Sea of Galilee. Had the miracle of loaves and fishes, and it's great. Let's go follow Jesus. I mean, this guy is really super cool, and he does miracles, and he made the whole bread and fish thing was totally amazing. If he's doing all that now, and he's only 33 years old, you know, this is going to be great. He will be a good person to be a follower of. And so Jesus got his followers. After chapter 8, Jesus moves south into Judea, the rocky desert land. And as he moves into Judea, things begin to go bad. He gets to Jerusalem, despite a very warm initial welcome, things will go really bad for him in Jerusalem, resulting finally in the crucifixion. Curious thing about Mark, in the earliest manuscripts we have now, Mark doesn't end with any resurrection appearances of Jesus, which is a little strange. We do have Mark 16, 1 through 8, 3 women coming to his tomb and finding that he is not in the tomb. His funerary clothes are still there, but Jesus is gone. An angel appears to the women and tells them, "You seek Jesus of Nazareth. He is not here." And get this next thing that the angel says. He is going on into Galilee, and there you will see him. Galilee, the places where all the good things happen. Galilee, the place where where they will see the resurrected Jesus. So that's the that's the geographical kind of underpinning that Mark writes. Now, if you read, for example, the Gospel of John, in Mark, it's just this one trip to Jerusalem, the trip that gets him crucified. In John, Jesus has several trips back and forth between Galilee and Judea. So again, this is indicative that Mark is putting together his story with particular points that, and the work really is genius what he does. A second theme is messianic secret. Jesus, in those first 8 chapters, what does Jesus always tell people to do after he heals them? Don't, yeah, don't tell anybody about it. Keep it secret. And of course, what other people do, I mean, they go out and tell people about it anyway, but he keeps, and why does Jesus want this secret about his identity? Now, there is one group, however, who know who Jesus is from the very beginning. Anybody know? The demon.
The demon?
Yes, the demons. Jesus will he cast out, there are 7 demon exorcisms. In Mark, you could contrast that with John, which has no demon exorcisms. But in the demon exorcism, the demons, none of the humans know who Jesus is, that he's the Son of God, that he's the Messiah, but the demons know. And when he's casting one out, the demon will say something like, I know who you are, the Holy One of Israel. I know who you are, Son of God. The demons know, but the people don't until chapter 8. And why is the Messianic secret an invention, a literary invention of Mark, or is that the way that the history of Jesus went? It's not a question I wanted to deal with at the moment. Okay, then the third theme that also hinges on chapter 8 is a theme of suffering. And the last thing I read to you, if you want to be my disciple, you must take up your cross and follow me. The disciples followed him, at least with the combination of New Testament references and various other reliable ancient sources. We know that 11 of the 12 disciples died for their faith, were martyred. So Mark, in his effort to focus on this theme of suffering, leaves us hanging at the end. And it's such a weird ending. I will read the last couple of verses in Mark 16, and the women go to the tomb. They see that the stone has been rolled away. The angel tells them, well, I say angel, it says man in a white robe. Oh, the resurrection scenes in the Bible have lots of inconsistencies. In Mark, it is a young man who tells to the women, speaks to the women in the tomb. In Matthew, it's an angel who speaks to the women in the tomb. In Luke, it's two men who speak to the women in the tomb. And in John, it's two angels who speak to the women, the woman in this case, Mary, John's case, who is in the tomb. And then, so the angel is telling them, and then verse 8, after the angel has told them that they will see him in Galilee, verse 8, so they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. That is such a weird way to end the gospel. You would think they should be going out and telling everyone that Jesus has been raised. It's even very odd ending grammatically, for the last word is the Greek word gar, which means for or because, and then it's left. And of course, this still leads many to think that Jesus is well, leads many to think that Jesus was not going to appear in Jerusalem, although he does so in Luke and John, but the resurrected Jesus would be away in Galilee. So if that led to two separate longer endings of Mark, scholars are unanimous that these longer endings of Mark are spurious, were not a part of the original gospel. Although a large number, maybe the majority of scholars, think there was more to Mark than what we have. That there may have been a lost page that contains resurrection appearances of Jesus. And I thought I would show you, I have a book here that has photographs of New Testament manuscripts, and you can look, it does not have P45, which is the earliest manuscript of Mark, about 200. Here's P46 and what a manuscript looks like. And I'll pass that out, or what that one, don't get all shuffling through all of them, but you can look at one or two pictures. It's one of the worst things about early Greek manuscripts is they write in what is called lingua continua. They write as without separating the words. And so makes it very difficult. You have to be a really good scholar, papyrologist, to be able to read most of the early Greek manuscripts. Let me hear your questions or thoughts at this point. My colleague. Yes. Uh-oh, okay, uh-oh, the microphone, yes.
I had one question that goes back to the very beginning. Were you saying that the lectionary has a 4-year cycle,
Three,
a 3-year cycle, and that each cycle emphasizes one of the gospels?
right, Matthew, Mark, or Luke.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that. Well, let me just ask you another question. Where did the lectionary come from? It seems so widely utilized by all parts of the Christian faith, I guess. I don't know if it's just Protestant, but I mean, it's pretty widely accepted. And it's a little bit of an aside, but
Excuse me. Goes way back. Way back. 5th century, we began to get our first lectionary manuscripts. And one of the things, there are right now about 5,600, just under 5,600 New Testament, Greek New Testament manuscripts. They go from the earliest in 2nd century, the latest 15th century. When the printing press was invented, after that, there were hardly any manuscripts made. And since we already had it in print, that manuscript making became obsolete. And of those 6,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts, and believe it, 1933, I think, of those manuscripts, or close to a third, are lectionaries. One of the things you may have noticed in Duke Chapel, if you've been going for a while, in the choir procession, we used to bring up the Bible. There used to be a person in the procession who would bring the Bible, a right heavy Bible too, the pulpit Bible up to the pulpit. Now they bring a much thinner book. That book is a lectionary for, I don't know that, I've never looked actually in it, I don't think, but lectionary that probably contains the readings for the whole lectionary, or at least for 1 year. So, yeah.
But what does the term mean, lectionary?
Selection of reading, selection. We have all of these lecto words from the Latin word for reading, which is lectio. So it's the collection of readings. And I guess I really haven't got to your question yet, because what we all use now is called the Revised Common Lectionary. It was completed in 1982, and we have been using that one since that time. Other questions, thoughts?
Isn't it also true that while the lectionary existed, at least to my observation, Methodist, Baptist, some moderately large number of Protestant denominations really didn't make use of it? It was more high church until the last few decades.
Still many who don't make use of it. So the lectionary, and sort of the knock against the next lectionary, is that first of all, it doesn't contain every passage in the Bible. There are plenty of passages in the Bible that I'm glad are not in the lectionary. one of those bloody, let me tell you a quick story that's not in the lectionary. It's in, 2 Kings, when Elisha, who is, Elisha is bald. And some boys come up to him and start making fun of him and say, "Hey, you baldy, you baldy." And then the next line is Elisha called 42 she-bears out of the wilderness who came and devoured the boys. That's, again, that's not in the lection, and you won't hear that one preached on much. So yeah, the lectionary does that. I think there are a couple of other things that I wish the lectionary didn't do. In the Psalms, frequently it will leave out. You'll have, there's a psalm reading every week. Usually it's sung here. And if you read the summary, it'll say what verses 1 through 4 and 11, 14. Well, you know what that makes me want to do? Find out what was in 5 through 10. And usually what was in 5 through 10 is something about how God is going to destroy evildoers and some hard stuff. So the lectionary in its selection creates its own theology. And that theology is basically the theology of mainline Protestant churches. And the good thing about the lectionary, the great thing about the lectionary, is that you don't have 42 sermons a year on John 3:16. It does not allow the pastor to pick his favorite passages to preach on. You got some choice, but sometimes you're going to have to confront and preach on difficult text. Okay, yes.
Well, that leads me to another question. If somebody comes to Duke Chapel to preach, are they obligated to preach from the lectionary, or can they choose their own topic, so to speak? Or, I mean, is that true in other churches as well? I never really thought about it.
I would have to check to make sure, but I think the answer is yes, that they are obligated to preach from one of the texts. We had, a couple of months ago, we had a very famous Baptist Bible teacher who was giving the sermon, Beth Moore, and she mentioned one or two things from a lectionary reading, maybe, but her sermon was totally not based on what was read. You know, so it's those texts are going to be read, and you are meant to speak on them, to preach on them. I had once, a couple of years ago, when I was speaking, it was during the summertime, and in the summertime then, Duke Chapel departed from the lectionary and did one whole book, or parts of one. We were doing Ezekiel that year. And it was guest preachers. And I remember when I read that text from Ezekiel, from the lectern in Duke Chapel, I had to tell them to begin with that I felt good, but Ezekiel, whom I was reading, was mad. and I would be, and it was a ferocious God reading. And the pastor, the preacher of the morning, remembered him telling me, does Luke not like me that he stuck me with this text to preach on? So, yeah, so the lectionary, we have changed. We're not doing, we are going to do lectionary year round now at Duke Chapel. Now, some denominations like Episcopalians, Catholics have always done lectionary for hundreds and hundreds of years. Greek, and of course, Greek Orthodox have always done the lectionary. Other questions or thoughts? I got a few minutes left. So, okay, anything you ever wanted to know about the Bible, please ask now. I'll do my best. Oh.
Nobody else has any questions, so I'm gonna keep going. So my next question is, how did you get interested in this topic? And you've obviously thought about it for a long time related to Mark and these issues. So can you share a little bit of that?
Pretty easy. When I was in my third year in divinity school here, and taking graduate level courses then. So I had a graduate course. I think there were a couple of other divinity students, but it's mostly graduate students in the class with the late Dr. Moody Smith, a course on Mark. And it became very interesting to me. It is, I should know, not my specialization is Acts, and and we did that Acts for a year, 2 years ago, I guess. So, but yes, Mark's always held some intrigue for me. Mark was the least popular gospel. We have fewer manuscripts of Mark than we have of any other gospel. And so, yeah, but it's interesting. You know what I really don't like to teach? John. John is so problematic, so different from the other three, and very theological. I'm not very theological. Occasionally someone has referred to me as a theologian. I am not a theologian. I'm a humble biblical scholar. So there are things that I enjoy teaching that I've spent a lot of, done a lot of work on Revelation. Most of my publications are on Revelation. So just different things will interest different scholars. For you know, you teach, you teach a whole introductory course on New Testament, and then upper level courses on whatever you particularly like, I think. So, you know, that's how I got interested. Other questions or thoughts? Yes, Ken.
Would you add your thoughts regarding the last part of Mark's gospel there, where the addition that was in the manuscripts later has pretty much been discounted? Any research that you have looked at that would posit other options that may have been a conclusion to Mark's gospel?
Yeah, similar, perhaps similar resurrection appearances to those we find in the other gospels. But very odd and very, I mean, it's obviously intentional that he's stopping it where he is. I was thinking about this last night, and I wonder if Mark may have intended, like Luke did, writing a second volume. What was Luke's second volume?
Acts.
Acts. I wonder if Mark may have had that intention, but never got around to it, or it didn't get reproduced. And that's one of the main things about, when you, before the printing press, you're dealing with very limited production of written materials. Yeah, and probably, just the theory of papyrus, it's in the beginning of the 4th century is when papyrus goes out and we start using animal skins, particularly pig skins, vellum. And I remember when I was first reading about manuscripts, you had what they called, you read manuscript per page and it's vellum, you got, or parchment is another word, vellum is specifically from pigs. They called it the skin side and the flesh side. That struck me as a very odd way to put it, but that's the way it was with these writing materials. Yeah. Okay. We've got time for about one more question. Yes, Dean.
Speaking of pigskins, I'm wondering about Jewish what we call the Old Testaments, or Jewish Bibles printed after that 4th or 5th century. I can't imagine the Jews using pigskins to put their scriptures on. What do they use?
Other animal skins. I mean, calf primarily. After, when people would use every bit of the animal for one thing or another. And so, yeah, that would normally be it, calf skins. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you all very much.
Well,
Should
thank
we-
you. We want to show our appreciation to you in the classroom and online. We can just give We always enjoy all of the insight and information, data that you have. It's like a walking encyclopedia. It's always very interesting. So thank you. Next week, we have N. Mills, who is coming again. He's the visiting assistant professor of classics and religious studies at Hamilton College. So he will be joining us to talk about Paul's epistle to the Laodiceans. So we look forward to hearing him next week. Have a great day. Thanks.
And that Paul's epistle to the Laodiceans, if you look that up in your Bible, it's not there. It didn't make into the Bible, and we really don't have it. So I'll be really interested in what he has to say. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do we need to ask you back for a go round to hear about Nero and Josephus